During the summer of 1998, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Colorado, four cousins went missing under mysterious circumstances, and investigators had no answers. More than 25 years later, a single discovery changed everything, and what they found shocked everyone. The Vance and the Miller families were more than just relatives. They were neighbors, living just two doors down from each other in the peaceful, mountain-ringed town of Durango, Colorado. The two families shared a deep, unbreakable bond, but the true heart of their connection was the children. There were four of them, and despite the differences in their ages, they were completely inseparable. Harrison Miller was 18, a strong, quiet, and deeply responsible young man who had just graduated from high school. He was the protector of the group, the one the adults trusted to handle anything. His younger sister, Clara, was 16, a bright and artistic girl who rarely went anywhere without her sketchbook and charcoal pencils. Then there were their cousins. Julian Vance was 15, tall for his age, athletic, and fiercely loyal to Harrison. And finally, there was little Maya Vance. At 12 years old, Maya was the baby of the family, a sweet and energetic girl with a loud laugh that could fill any room. Because their parents worked long hours at the local hardware store and the regional hospital, the four cousins basically raised each other during the summer months. They spent their days riding bikes through the winding suburban streets, swimming in the chilly rivers, and hiking the lower trails of the San Juan Mountains. They operated as a single unit. Where you found one, you found the other three. Camping was a massive part of their lives. Growing up in southwestern Colorado meant that the wilderness was essentially their backyard. Since Harrison had turned 16 and gotten his driver's license, the parents had started allowing the cousins to take weekend camping trips on their own. They always went to the same general area, a remote but familiar spot deep in the San Juan National Forest. It was a beautiful, isolated clearing near a rushing creek, surrounded by towering ponderosa pines and thick groves of aspen trees. The trip planned for the second weekend of August in 1998 was supposed to be a celebration. Harrison was preparing to leave for college in another state at the end of the month, and this was going to be their final summer adventure together before everything changed. The entire week leading up to the trip was filled with excitement. Clara bought a fresh set of drawing pencils to sketch the mountain landscape. Julian packed his fishing gear, boasting that he would catch enough trout to feed them all weekend. Maya packed her favorite cassette tapes and a small, worn-out teddy bear she had slept with since she was a toddler. Harrison meticulously checked the camping gear, the first aid kit, and the tires on his dark green 1993 Chevy Tahoe. On Friday, August 14th, the morning of the trip, the mood in the neighborhood was light and happy. The parents stood in the driveway, holding mugs of coffee, smiling as the teenagers loaded the heavy canvas tents and sleeping bags into the back of the SUV. Paul Miller, Harrison and Clara's father, walked up to the driver's side window and leaned in. He gave Harrison a firm pat on the shoulder. He told his son to drive safely, to keep the campfire small, and to make sure the food was locked in the vehicle at night to keep the bears away. Harrison smiled, nodding confidently. He promised they would be careful. He promised he would look out for the younger ones. Diane Vance, Julian and Maya's mother, hugged her children tightly. She kissed the top of Maya's head and told her to listen to Harrison. As the green Chevy Tahoe pulled out of the driveway and headed down the street, Diane felt a brief, inexplicable twinge of anxiety, a heavy feeling in her chest, but she quickly brushed it off. They had done this a dozen times before. Harrison was practically an adult. They were perfectly safe. The drive into the San Juan National Forest took about 2 hours. The paved highway eventually turned into a rugged, winding gravel road that climbed higher and higher into the mountains. The air grew cooler and thinner, carrying the sharp, clean scent of pine needles and damp earth. According to the plan, they were supposed to set up camp at their usual spot, spend Friday and Saturday night under the stars, and return home by Sunday afternoon. Because cell phone service was completely non-existent in the mountains back in 1998, the families relied on a strict check-in system. There was a small ranger station with a public payphone about a 40-minute drive from the campsite. Harrison was supposed to drive down to the payphone on Saturday evening and call home just to let everyone know they were okay. Friday passed without incident. The parents enjoyed a quiet, peaceful evening in Durango. Saturday arrived, bringing clear blue skies and warm sunshine. Back in town, Paul and Diane spent the day doing yard work and running errands. As evening approached, they gathered at the Miller house, ordering a pizza and waiting for Harrison's phone call. At exactly 7:30 on Saturday night, the kitchen phone rang. Paul answered it. It was Harrison. The connection was a little staticky, but Harrison's voice was clear and calm. He said everything was perfect. He said the campsite was beautiful, the weather was holding up, and Julian had actually managed to catch 2 fish in the creek. He mentioned that Clara was drawing by the fire and Maya was currently trying to toast the perfect marshmallow. Paul smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. He told Harrison to have a good night, to keep the fire contained, and that they would see them on Sunday afternoon. Harrison said good night, and the line went dead. That brief, crackling phone call would be the very last time any of the parents ever heard from their children. If you enjoy real missing person mysteries like this, please subscribe. It really helps our channel grow. Sunday morning dawned overcast and unusually cold for August. Heavy gray clouds rolled over the mountain peaks, threatening rain. Back in Durango, Paul woke up early. He decided to drive up to the campsite to surprise the kids with a box of fresh donuts and help them pack up the heavy tents. It was a fatherly gesture, something he occasionally did to save Harrison the trouble of breaking down the camp alone. He left the house just after 8 in the morning, enjoying the quiet Sunday drive up the mountain passes. The gravel road was muddy from a light overnight drizzle, and the forest seemed incredibly still. There were no other vehicles on the logging road, no hikers on the trails. Around 10 o'clock, Paul's truck rounded the final bend and pulled into the dirt clearing where the cousins always camped. Right away, Paul felt a strange tightness in his stomach. Harrison's dark green Chevy Tahoe was parked in its usual spot under a massive pine tree. The 2 large canvas tents were set up perfectly in the center of the clearing. The fire ring was filled with white ash, but there was no movement. There was no sound. Paul put his truck in park and stepped out into the damp morning air. He called out Harrison's name, expecting to hear a muffled groan from inside one of the tents. There was no answer. He called out for Clara, Julian, and Maya. The only sound was the wind rushing through the tops of the pine trees and the steady babble of the nearby creek. He walked toward the fire pit. The ashes were completely cold. A half-empty bag of marshmallows was sitting on a folding chair, wet from the morning dew. A plastic cooler was sitting next to the Tahoe. Paul felt his heart rate begin to climb. He walked over to the first tent, the one the boys usually shared. The flap was zipped shut. He reached down, unzipped it, and pulled the canvas back. The tent was empty. The sleeping bags were unrolled and looked as if they had been slept in, but there was no sign of Harrison or Julian. Panic starting to claw at his throat, Paul ran to the second tent. He threw open the flap. It was empty too. Clara's sketchbook was lying open on her sleeping bag, and resting right next to it was Maya's worn-out teddy bear. Paul stepped back, his breathing turning rapid and shallow. He looked around the clearing, spinning in a circle, shouting their names as loud as his lungs would allow. His voice echoed off the canyon walls, fading into the dense, endless woods. He walked over to Harrison's Tahoe and peered through the driver's side window. The keys were still sitting in the ignition. Harrison's wallet was resting on the center console. They wouldn't just wander off into the deep woods without their belongings. They were experienced campers. They knew the rules of the forest. Desperate, Paul began to search the perimeter of the campsite, looking for footprints in the soft mud, looking for any sign of which direction they might have gone. He pushed through a thick patch of brush near the edge of the creek, his eyes scanning the ground. That was when he stopped dead in his tracks. Lying in the mud, about 30 yards away from the tents, was a heavy steel flashlight. It belonged to Harrison. But that wasn't what made Paul's blood run cold. Just a few feet away from the flashlight, half buried in the wet earth, was a large hunting knife. And caught on the jagged bark of a nearby tree, fluttering in the cold wind, was a torn, blood-stained piece of fabric that perfectly matched the flannel shirt Julian had been wearing when he left home. Paul stood completely frozen, his eyes locked on the jagged hunting knife and the torn, blood-stained fabric. His mind desperately tried to reject what he was seeing. He recognized the piece of flannel instantly. It was from the red and black shirt Julian had been wearing when he hugged his mother goodbye. A wave of pure nausea washed over Paul. He knew he couldn't touch the knife. He knew he couldn't step any closer to the blood. All of his fatherly instincts screamed at him to run into the woods, to tear down every tree until he found his children, but a cold, hard logic took over. Something terrible had happened here. He needed help. Paul sprinted back to his truck. His hands were shaking so violently that it took him 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. He threw the truck into reverse, spun the tires in the wet mud, and tore down the gravel logging road. He drove recklessly, taking the mountain curves far too fast, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The 40-minute drive to the ranger station felt like an absolute eternity. When he finally saw the small wooden building, he slammed on the brakes, leaving the truck running in the dirt lot. He ran to the public payphone bolted to the outside wall. He fumbled a quarter into the slot and dialed 911. The emergency dispatcher answered calmly, but Paul's voice was completely broken. He shouted that his children were missing. He gave the location of the campsite. He told them about the empty tents, the abandoned vehicle, the heavy flashlight lying in the dirt, and the blood on the torn fabric. The dispatcher promised that deputies were already on their way and told Paul to stay exactly where he was. But Paul had one more call to make. It was the hardest thing he would ever have to do in his entire life. He dropped another quarter into the machine and dialed his own home number. Diane answered on the second ring, expecting it to be Paul calling to say he was helping the kids pack up. Instead, she heard the sound of her brother-in-law sobbing. When Paul forced the words out, telling her that the campsite was empty and Julian's torn shirt was covered in blood, Diane dropped the phone. It clattered against the kitchen floor. Paul could hear a horrible, gut-wrenching scream echo through the receiver before the line went dead. Within an hour, the quiet San Juan National Forest was transformed into a massive crime scene. The local sheriff's department arrived first, securing the dirt road and stringing bright yellow police tape around the clearing. Dozens of officers swarmed the area. By noon, Paul, Diane, and their spouses were standing behind the police line, clutching each other, their faces pale with terror. Diane held Maya's small, worn-out teddy bear against her chest, rocking back and forth as she watched the detectives carefully photograph the tents. The initial investigation moved incredibly fast, fueled by the sheer panic of 4 children vanishing at once. Crime scene technicians carefully collected the hunting knife, the heavy flashlight, and the torn fabric. They dusted Harrison's green Chevy Tahoe for fingerprints. They photographed the half-eaten bag of marshmallows and Clara's open sketchbook. The first major piece of news from the investigators only deepened the family's nightmare. The heavy hunting knife found in the mud didn't belong to a stranger. It belonged to Harrison. It was his own personal camping knife, the one he always kept inside his backpack for cutting rope. Why was it out? And why was it lying in the dirt next to his cousin's torn shirt? By late afternoon, the search and rescue teams arrived. They brought highly trained tracking dogs, specifically bloodhounds, to trace the cousin's scent. The handlers let the dogs smell items from the tents: Harrison's jacket, Clara's blanket, Julian's shoes, and Maya's pillow. The dogs locked onto a scent almost immediately. They pulled their handlers away from the tents, moving directly toward the spot where the flashlight had been dropped. From there, the dogs tracked the scent through a dense patch of thorny bushes, moving downhill toward the rushing waters of the creek. The family watched with a tiny spark of hope. If the dogs had a trail, they could find them. But then the dogs stopped. Right at the muddy bank of the cold, fast-moving creek, the bloodhounds began to pace in frantic circles. They whined and sniffed the air, confused. The handlers tried to cast them up and down the shoreline, hoping they would pick up the trail on the other side. But it was useless. The scent just ended at the water's edge. It was as if all four teenagers had simply stepped into the freezing river and vanished from the face of the earth. As the sun began to set on Sunday evening, the reality of the situation crashed down on everyone. The temperature in the mountains was dropping fast. If the kids were out there, lost in the woods, they were facing a freezing night without any heavy winter coats. The police set up a massive command center at the ranger station. They brought in heavy floodlights, industrial generators, and topographical maps of the entire mountain range. For the next 2 weeks, the search effort was relentless. Hundreds of local volunteers from Durango marched shoulder to shoulder through the dense pine forests, poking the ground with walking sticks. Helicopters with thermal imaging cameras flew low over the tree canopy, scanning for any heat signatures in the wilderness. Police divers were brought in to search the deepest pools of the creek, battling the dangerous currents to look for any sign that the kids had been swept away. They found nothing, not a single shoe, not a dropped piece of clothing, not a single footprint beyond the campsite. The forensic results on the torn fabric came back from the state lab a few days later. The blood was human and it matched Julian's blood type. However, the medical examiner noted a strange detail. There was only a very small amount of blood on the fabric. It was consistent with a minor cut or a scrape, completely insufficient to indicate a fatal injury. The hunting knife itself was perfectly clean. There was no blood on the blade or the handle. This left investigators completely baffled. If Harrison had dropped his knife and Julian had snagged his shirt and cut himself, where did they go? Why would they leave the campsite in the middle of the night? And why would they leave the keys in the vehicle? Theories began to circulate through the panicked community. Some suggested it was a wild animal attack, perhaps a hungry bear or a mountain lion that had wandered into the camp. But the wildlife experts quickly shut that down. An animal attack of that scale would have left a massive, chaotic mess. There would be drag marks, significant blood pools, and scattered equipment. The campsite was simply too clean. Others suggested the kids had decided to run away, but the parents knew that was entirely impossible. Harrison was incredibly responsible and excited about starting college. Clara had left her precious sketchbook out in the open. Maya had left her childhood teddy bear, something she never slept without. You don't pack for a new life and leave your wallet, your vehicle, and your most prized possessions behind. The darkest theory, and the one the police quietly leaned toward, was a stranger abduction, but even that made no logical sense. The campsite was located at the very end of a miles-long, rough gravel road. Anyone driving up there would have been heard long before they arrived. Furthermore, there were no signs of a struggle inside the tents. No torn mesh, no broken poles, no trampled grass around the sleeping bags. How does someone kidnap 4 healthy teenagers, including an athletic 18-year-old and a 15-year-old boy, without making a sound, without leaving tire tracks, and without causing a massive fight? Days slowly turned into weeks. The warm summer faded into a crisp, cold autumn. The yellow ribbons tied around the oak trees in Durango began to fray and fade in the rain. Paul and Diane spent every waking hour at the police station, desperately begging the detectives to keep looking. The families were slowly falling apart under the weight of the unknown. The Miller and Vance homes, once filled with constant laughter and the slamming of screen doors, were now completely silent. Diane began sleeping in Maya's bedroom, curling up on the small bed and crying until the sun came up. By December, the first heavy snows hit the San Juan Mountains, burying the abandoned campsite under 3 feet of solid white ice. The physical search had to be officially suspended. The police promised they would resume in the spring, but everyone knew what that meant. It was no longer a rescue mission. It was a recovery operation. The case officially went cold. Before we continue, if this story has kept you watching, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. 6 months after the disappearance, the snow finally began to melt in the higher elevations. The local sheriff's office decided to send a small team of detectives back up to the logging road to do one final sweep of the surrounding ridges. Hoping the spring thaw might reveal something they had missed in the chaos of the initial search. They weren't expecting to find much. The area had been walked over by hundreds of volunteers. A seasoned detective named Mark Halstead decided to hike up a steep, heavily wooded embankment that overlooked the original campsite. It was a difficult climb, fighting through thick branches and loose rocks. When he finally reached the top of the ridge, he paused to catch his breath. He looked down through the trees. From this high vantage point, he had a perfect, unobstructed view of the exact spot where Harrison's tents had been set up. Detective Halstead began to walk the length of the ridge. The ground here was rocky and covered in a thick carpet of dead pine needles. Suddenly, something caught his eye. Tucked behind a massive, fallen oak tree, completely hidden from the main trail, was a small, flattened patch of dirt. Halstead carefully approached it. The brush had been intentionally cleared away. Someone had spent a lot of time sitting in this exact spot. He pulled on a pair of latex gloves and knelt down. Hidden under a layer of wet leaves, he found a small pile of cigarette butts. They were old and weathered, but they had clearly been smoked by someone sitting behind the fallen tree. Then his eyes caught a dull reflection in the dirt. He brushed away the soil and pulled out a small, black plastic object. It was a heavy-duty lens cap, the kind that belonged to an expensive pair of long-range binoculars. Halstead felt a cold shiver run down his spine as he looked from the lens cap down toward the empty campsite below. The kids hadn't just vanished into thin air. They hadn't been attacked by a random animal. Someone had been sitting up here on this ridge. Someone had been watching them through binoculars, and whoever it was, they had been waiting for the sun to go down. Detective Mark Halstead carefully used a pair of plastic tweezers to place the weathered cigarette butts into a brown paper evidence bag. He gently scooped up the heavy black plastic lens cap and placed it in a separate container. His heart was pounding as he hiked back down the steep ridge to the empty campsite. He finally had something real. He had physical proof that someone had been sitting in the woods, hiding behind that fallen oak tree, watching the 4 cousins. But the excitement was short-lived. When the evidence arrived at the state crime lab in Denver, the reality of 1999 forensic technology set in. The cigarette butts had been sitting in the dirt for 6 months, subjected to freezing temperatures, heavy snow, and the damp spring thaw. The paper was completely disintegrated, and any trace of saliva or DNA had been thoroughly washed away by the harsh mountain weather. The lens cap was equally useless. The technicians dusted it for fingerprints, but the rough, textured plastic didn't hold any prints, and whatever oils might have been left behind by human hands had long since faded. The only thing the police could determine was that the cap belonged to a highly expensive, military-grade pair of binoculars, not something a casual hiker would carry. It was a terrifying confirmation of the police's worst fears. A predator had stalked the children, but without a name, a face, or a usable piece of DNA, the case slammed into a solid brick wall. 25 years slowly slipped away. The world changed, but the deep, suffocating grief in Durango, Colorado, remained exactly the same. The passing of 2.5 decades was merciless on the Vance and Miller families. Paul's dark hair turned completely white, and his shoulders stooped under the heavy burden of never knowing how he failed to protect his son and daughter. Diane Vance eventually had to sell her home. She couldn't bear to look at the Miller house 2 doors down. knowing her children, Julian and Maya, used to run across that very lawn every single day. Birthdays came and went in absolute silence. Holidays were agonizingly painful. There were always 4 empty chairs at the Thanksgiving table. The families never gave up hope, but as the calendar turned to the year 2023, that hope had transformed into a dull, lingering ache. The local police department had long ago moved the massive cardboard boxes of the case files into a dusty storage room. But then everything suddenly changed. In the fall of 2023, the Durango Police Department received a federal grant to modernize their cold case unit. They hired a sharp, tech-savvy detective named Sarah Jenkins. Her first assignment was to take the oldest, most extensive files in the storage room and completely digitize them. She spent weeks scanning thousands of pages of original police reports, witness statements, and search grid maps into a modern computer database. During this process, Detective Jenkins went through the physical evidence boxes. By law, any personal items that held no forensic value could finally be released back to the families. Jenkins packed these items into a large, brown paper envelope and drove out to Paul Miller's house. Paul sat at his kitchen table, his hands trembling as he opened the envelope. Inside were things he hadn't seen in 25 years. There was Harrison's leather wallet, perfectly preserved. There was Clara's sketchbook, still open to a half-finished drawing of a pine tree, and at the bottom of the envelope was a thick stack of 4x6 glossy photographs. Back in 1998, the police had found Clara's bright yellow disposable camera sitting inside the tent. They had developed the 24 exposures hopping to find a clue, but all they found were normal, everyday pictures of the kids setting up camp, smiling by the creek, and eating dinner. Finding nothing suspicious, the police had simply tossed the photos into the box. Paul spent hours staring at those pictures, tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. It was like looking into a time machine. They looked so happy, so incredibly alive. Because the 25th anniversary of their disappearance was approaching, Paul decided he wanted to do something special. He wanted to take the best photograph from the stack and have it blown up into a large canvas portrait for a memorial service they were planning at the local church. He bought a high-resolution digital photo scanner, carefully wiped the dust off the glossy prints, and began scanning them into his computer. The last photo in the stack was a group picture. According to the time of day and the lighting, it must have been taken on Friday evening, right before the sun went down. Clara had apparently set the disposable camera on a flat rock, pushed the 10-second timer button, and run into the frame. When the scanned image popped up on Paul's large, high-definition computer monitor, it took his breath away. It was a beautiful family photo. Harrison, Clara, Julian, and Maya were all sitting side by side on a heavy wooden log near the fire pit. They had their arms wrapped around each other, laughing genuinely at the camera. Paul leaned in close to the screen. He wanted to crop the edges of the photo to remove some dark shadows before sending it to the print shop. He used his mouse to zoom in, magnifying the digital pixels. As the background of the image enlarged, Paul's eyes drifted past the smiling faces of his children, past the roaring campfire, and up toward the dense tree line in the distance. He was looking at the steep ridge, the exact same ridge where Detective Halstead had found the cigarette butts a year later. Paul stopped breathing. His hand completely froze on the computer mouse. There in the deep background, half hidden behind the massive trunk of a fallen oak tree, was a figure. Because the original photograph was a small 4x6 print, the police in 1998 had never noticed it. It just looked like a dark shadow in the woods. But now, blown up on a modern, high-definition monitor, the shadow took a distinct, terrifying shape. It was a man. Paul felt a rush of ice-cold adrenaline flood his veins. He zoomed in even tighter, his heart hammering against his ribs. The man was standing perfectly still, leaning against the dead oak tree. He was wearing a dark green jacket, and raised to his eyes, pointing directly down at the four cousins, was a pair of heavy, black binoculars. The stalker had been watching them from the very first night. If you want more emotional cold case stories like this, please subscribe. Your support truly means a lot to us. Paul grabbed his phone and dialed the police station with shaking fingers. Within 20 minutes, Detective Sarah Jenkins was standing in his kitchen, staring at the glowing computer screen in absolute stunned silence. Jenkins knew instantly that this was the breakthrough they had been waiting 25 years for. She immediately took the digital file back to the police station and sent it to the State Crime Lab's Digital Forensics Unit. They had software that could sharpen old film grains and pull details out of shadows that were completely invisible to the naked eye. 2 days later, the forensic technicians sent the enhanced image back to Detective Jenkins. When she opened the file, she felt sick to her stomach. The software had clarified the man's face, but he was wearing a heavy dark ski mask pulled down over his features, completely concealing his identity. However, the enhancement revealed something else, something far more dangerous. Just over the man's right shoulder, partially obscured by the thick pine branches, the sunlight was reflecting off a piece of metal on the logging road behind him. The software enhanced the colors and the contrast, bringing the metal object into sharp focus. It was the front fender and hood of a vehicle parked on the upper ridge. The vehicle was painted bright white, and running along the side of the fender was a very distinct, thick, forest green stripe. It wasn't a random hunter's truck. It wasn't a lost tourist. It was an official United States Forest Service vehicle. Detective Jenkins immediately pulled the 1998 case files. She spread the original duty rosters across her desk, her eyes scanning the faded ink. She cross-referenced the shift logs with the exact weekend of August 14, 1998. Only one Forest Service ranger had been assigned to patrol that specific quadrant of the San Juan National Forest that weekend. His name was Ranger Greg Thorne. Jenkins felt a cold dread wash over her as she dug deeper into Thorne's file. He was a highly respected local outdoorsman. But when she read the initial police reports from the Sunday the kids went missing, a terrifying realization struck her. Greg Thorne wasn't just working that weekend. When Paul Miller had rushed down the mountain in a panic to use the payphone, he had used the phone attached to Thorne's ranger station. Thorne was the one who had unlocked the gates for the police. Thorne was the one who had provided the topographical maps to the sheriff's department. And most horrifying of all, Greg Thorne was the man who had actively guided the volunteer search parties and the tracking dogs through the woods, specifically telling them which areas to avoid because they were supposedly too dangerous to hike. The man who had stalked the cousins from the ridge, the man who had watched them through expensive military-grade binoculars, was the exact same man the police had trusted to help find them. Detective Sarah Jenkins sat in the dim light of the police archives, her heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. The glowing computer screen cast a pale blue light across the scattered files on her desk. The realization of what she was looking at was entirely sickening. A wave of pure nausea washed over her as the puzzle pieces from 25 years ago violently locked into place. Greg Thorne was not just a name in an old report. He was a local legend in Durango. He was a retired, highly decorated Forest Service ranger, a man who had spent 30 years protecting the wilderness and the people who visited it. He was a pillar of the community. Jenkins clearly remembered reading newspaper clippings from the fall of 1998, articles showing Ranger Thorne standing shoulder to shoulder with Paul Miller and Diane Vance at the community vigils. Thorne had held a candle in the church. He had looked into the eyes of the grieving parents and promised them he would never stop searching for their children. The level of absolute betrayal was terrifying. Jenkins knew she had to move carefully. Thorne was now 68 years old, living comfortably on a large, secluded piece of property on the rural outskirts of town. Because he was a former federal officer, he understood police tactics. He knew how investigations worked. If he suspected for even a single second that the Durango Police Department was looking into him, he had the resources and the knowledge to destroy any remaining evidence and disappear. Jenkins could not afford to make a single mistake. She needed bulletproof evidence before she could bring him in. She spent the next 48 hours locked inside the archive room, fueled by black coffee and pure adrenaline. She pulled every single document related to the 1998 search and rescue operation. She spread out the massive, coffee-stained topographical maps across the floor of the evidence room. These were the exact maps Greg Thorne had provided to the local sheriff's department on that chaotic Sunday morning. Jenkins grabbed a set of colored markers. She used a red marker to outline the grid zones where Thorne had actively directed the volunteer search parties and the tracking dogs. She traced the sweeping circles where hundreds of people had spent weeks walking shoulder to shoulder through the dense pine trees. Then, she took a blue marker and outlined the areas Thorne had officially declared as dangerous or impassable, areas he told the police were a complete waste of time to search. When Jenkins stepped back and looked at the map, a massive, chilling blind spot emerged. There was a huge sector of the forest, located exactly 2 miles downstream from the cousins' campsite, that had never been searched. Not by helicopters, not by dogs, and not by volunteers. Thorne had intentionally drawn the search grids to create a perfect circle around this specific area, actively pushing everyone away from it. Jenkins immediately logged into the county clerk's digital database and pulled the 1998 land ownership records for that exact unsearched sector. Her hands shook as she typed in the coordinates. The computer took a few seconds to load the archived deed. The land was not part of the San Juan National Forest. It was a privately owned, 50-acre parcel of deep woods, and the owner listed on the property deed was a holding company registered to a man named Arthur Thorne. It was Greg Thorne's late grandfather. The blind spot belonged to him. Everything began to make horrifying sense. It explained why the tracking dogs had suddenly lost the cousins' scent at the edge of the rushing creek. The dogs had been confused because the scent didn't go across the water. It went directly into it. Thorne had forced the 4 teenagers to walk downstream, directly through the freezing, fast-moving water, specifically to wash away their scent trail so the bloodhounds could never track them to his private property. Jenkins didn't wait for morning. She printed the enhanced photograph of the masked man watching the camp, the Forest Service vehicle logs, the manipulated topographical search maps, and the property deeds. She drove directly to the home of a district judge in the middle of the night. When the judge reviewed the documents, the color completely drained from his face. He recognized Greg Thorne's name immediately. Without asking a single question, the judge picked up his pen and signed a sweeping, no-knock search warrant for both Thorne's current suburban residence and the abandoned 50-acre mountain property. By dawn, the Durango Police Department had mobilized a massive, heavily armed tactical team. The operation was kept completely quiet. No sirens, no radio chatter on open channels. The tactical team split into 2 separate units. One heavily armed team drove to Thorne's suburban home to make the physical arrest. Jenkins volunteered to lead the second team directly into the mountains. The drive up the steep, winding gravel road felt like stepping back in time. The morning sky was gray and heavy with dark, threatening clouds, exactly as it had been on the Sunday morning Paul Miller discovered the empty campsite. Jenkins rode in the passenger seat of an unmarked tactical vehicle, her hands gripping her heavy bulletproof vest. The silence of the ancient pine forest felt suffocating. The convoy turned off the main logging road, breaking through a rusted, overgrown chain-link gate that marked the boundary of Thorne's private property. The tactical vehicles navigated slowly through the thick brush, their heavy tires crushing years of dead branches. Deep in the center of the 50-acre parcel, surrounded by massive, towering oak trees, sat an old, decaying hunting cabin. The roof was partially collapsed, and the wooden siding was blackened by decades of harsh mountain winters. It looked entirely abandoned, a forgotten relic rotting in the woods. The tactical team swarmed the property. Heavily armed officers kicked in the front door of the cabin, their tactical flashlights cutting through the thick, dusty darkness. They cleared the main room, the small kitchen, and a tiny back bedroom. The cabin was completely empty. There was nothing inside except broken furniture, empty beer cans, and a thick layer of animal droppings. The floorboards were rotting, and the windows were shattered. Jenkins stood in the center of the ruined living room, a heavy pit forming in her stomach. Had she been wrong? Had Thorne managed to clean up the evidence 25 years ago? She refused to believe it. A man who kept a pristine, hidden property strictly off the official search map didn't just use it for a weekend hunting trip. There was something here. She could feel it in her bones. She ordered the team to search the exterior. She told them to check every single inch of the ground, every fallen tree, and every pile of rocks. 10 minutes later, a young tactical officer shouted from the overgrown backyard. Jenkins sprinted through the tall, wet grass, pushing her way through a thick wall of thorny bushes. The officer was standing next to a massive, rotting pile of chopped firewood that was covered by a heavy, moldy canvas tarp. The tarp looked like it had been sitting there untouched for decades. But when the officer pulled the heavy canvas back, he revealed a set of solid concrete steps leading directly into the ground. At the bottom of the steps was a thick, heavy steel door built straight into the earth. It was completely hidden from above, invisible to any search helicopter or passing hiker. And securing the heavy steel latch was a massive, industrial-grade iron padlock. Jenkins felt a cold chill radiate through her entire body. This was not a root cellar. This was a custom-built, reinforced underground bunker. She signaled for the breaching team. A heavy-duty pair of hydraulic bolt cutters was brought down the concrete stairs. The officer clamped the thick steel jaws around the rusted padlock. With a loud, sharp crack that echoed loudly through the silent forest, the heavy lock snapped in half. Jenkins pulled her service weapon, her hands completely steady despite the violent pounding of her heart. She grabbed the rusted iron handle and pulled the heavy door open. A rush of freezing, stale, chemical-smelling air hit her face. It smelled deeply of damp earth, old metal, and something sweet and entirely synthetic. Jenkins clicked on her heavy tactical flashlight and stepped into the absolute darkness. The concrete bunker was massive, extending deep beneath the cabin. The walls were lined with thick, soundproofing foam panels. The ceiling was reinforced with heavy steel beams. There were no windows, no ventilation shafts. Once that heavy iron door closed, absolutely no sound could ever escape. She swept her bright flashlight beam across the room. The space was incredibly clean and highly organized, an absolute contrast to the rotting cabin above. Against the far concrete wall, Jenkins saw something that made her breath catch painfully in her throat. There were 4 metal folding chairs, lined up in a perfectly straight row. Jenkins walked slowly toward them, her flashlight beam trembling slightly. Resting on the floor in front of the first chair was a heavy, dark winter coat. It was the exact coat Harrison Miller had packed for the camping trip. In front of the second chair sat a pair of white athletic shoes, heavily stained with dark river mud. They belonged to Julian. Resting on the seat of the third chair was Clara's silver charm bracelet, the one she wore every single day. And sitting perfectly centered on the final chair was a tiny, delicate silver necklace with a butterfly pendant. It was Maya's. Tears immediately pricked the corners of Jenkins' eyes. The absolute reality of the nightmare crashed down on her. The 4 cousins had sat in these exact chairs. They had been kept down here, completely trapped in the terrifying darkness, while their parents desperately searched the woods just 2 miles away. But as Jenkins continued to sweep her flashlight around the reinforced bunker, she noticed something even stranger. There were no signs of a struggle. There was no blood on the concrete floor. There were no marks on the walls. The room was eerily peaceful. Then her light hit the center of the room. Sitting on a small, sturdy wooden table was a heavy metal lockbox. Unlike the rusted door outside, this lockbox was pristine, perfectly clean, and completely free of dust. It was clear that someone had been coming down into this bunker regularly over the past 25 years to maintain it. Jenkins approached the table. The lockbox didn't have a padlock. It was secured by a simple brass latch. She put her service weapon back into its holster, her fingers shaking slightly as she reached out and unfastened the latch. She slowly opened the heavy metal lid. Inside the box, resting on a piece of dark velvet cloth, was a standard police-issue microcassette audio recorder. It was an old model from the late 90s, the kind detectives used to record interrogations. Sitting right next to the tape recorder was a small, black, leather-bound notebook. Jenkins carefully picked up the black notebook and opened the cover. The handwriting inside was incredibly neat, meticulous, and sharply angled. The very first page was clearly dated August 15, 1998. It was the exact night the children had vanished. Written in thick black ink across the top of the page was a single chilling title, The Evacuation Protocol. Jenkins scanned the first few lines of the notebook. It wasn't a diary. It was a deeply detailed, step-by-step operational log. It outlined exact times, exact movements, and exact phrases to use. It was a master plan. Her hands trembling violently, Jenkins set the notebook down and picked up the heavy microcassette recorder. She checked the small plastic window. There was a tape inside, completely rewound to the very beginning. She pressed the heavy plastic play button. For a few terrifying seconds, the only sound coming from the small speaker was the harsh, staticky hiss of blank tape. Then, she heard the heavy metallic sound of the bunker door slamming shut and a heavy lock sliding into place. And then a voice broke through the static. It was a young man's voice, trembling with absolute, uncontrollable terror. It was a voice Jenkins had heard on old home videos provided by the family. It was 18-year-old Harrison Miller. "Please," Harrison's voice begged through the small speaker, his breath hitching wildly. "You said there was a wildfire. You said you were taking us to safety. Why did you lock the door? Please, my sister is crying. Let us out." Detective Sarah Jenkins stood completely frozen in the freezing, concrete bunker, the heavy microcassette recorder clutched tightly in her trembling hands. The sound of 18-year-old Harrison Miller's terrified voice echoed off the soundproof walls, shattering the silence of 25 years. On the small tape, Harrison was begging. He was asking why the heavy steel door had been locked. In the background of the recording, Jenkins could hear the muffled, panicked sobs of 16-year-old Clara and 12-year-old Maya. Then a second voice came through the small speaker. It was calm. It was chillingly flat, and it was instantly recognizable as former Forest Service Ranger Greg Thorne. "There is no wildfire, Harrison," Thorne's voice said smoothly over the tape. "I am in control here. If you all sit down in those chairs and keep quiet, no one will get hurt, but you belong to me now." A long, agonizing silence followed on the recording. Then, the tape captured the heavy, metallic sound of the bunker door locking from the outside, followed immediately by the desperate, frantic sound of Harrison throwing his entire body weight against the unyielding steel. The recording cut off with a sharp click. Jenkins felt a hot tear slide down her cheek. The sheer, calculated evil of the situation was almost impossible to process. She set the recorder down and picked up the black, leather-bound notebook. She needed to know the rest. She needed to know exactly how a trusted official had managed to make 4 healthy teenagers completely vanish without a single trace. As she read through the meticulously neat handwriting, the entire horrifying truth finally came to light. Greg Thorne was a man obsessed with absolute control. He had spent his entire life working in the vast, empty wilderness, acting as the ultimate authority figure in the mountains. Over the years, that authority had twisted into a dark, sickening god complex. He didn't just want to protect the forest, he wanted to own everything in it. He had spent months building the hidden bunker on his grandfather's abandoned property, waiting for the perfect opportunity to prove that he was smarter than everyone else, including local law enforcement. The notebook detailed exactly what happened on the night of August 15th, 1998. Thorne had been stalking the cousins since they arrived on Friday. He watched them from the high ridge through his military binoculars, learning their routines and waiting for total darkness. Late Saturday night, well after Harrison had made his check-in call from the payphone, Thorne walked directly into their campsite. He was wearing his official Forest Service uniform, carrying his heavy utility flashlight and his silver badge. He woke the teenagers up in a panic. He used his ultimate authority to tell them a massive, fast-moving wildfire had broken out in the valley below and was rapidly moving up the canyon toward their exact location. He told them the gravel road was already blocked by falling trees, making it impossible to drive the green Chevy Tahoe out. He commanded them to leave all their belongings behind, leave the keys in the ignition, and follow him immediately on foot to a designated underground emergency fire shelter. Because he was a uniformed ranger, because he was supposed to be the good guy, Harrison didn't hesitate. He trusted him completely. Thorne ordered them to move fast. As they hurried through the dark woods, Harrison had grabbed his heavy camping knife from his bag, just in case they encountered wild animals. Thorne noticed it and ordered Harrison to drop the knife and his heavy flashlight in the dirt so he could run faster. A few moments later, in the absolute pitch black of the forest, young Julian tripped over a jagged tree root. He fell hard into a thorny bush, tearing his red flannel shirt and scraping his arm. That explained the tiny amount of blood and the torn fabric found near the knife. Thorne then led the terrified cousins directly into the freezing, rushing water of the creek. He told them they had to walk downstream through the water to avoid the imaginary fire's path. But in reality, Thorne knew exactly what he was doing. By forcing them to walk 2 miles through the fast-moving river, he completely washed away their scent trail, guaranteeing the police bloodhounds would lose the track right at the water's edge. When they finally reached the hidden cabin, Thorne led them down the concrete stairs and into the bunker under the false promise of safety. And then he locked the door. Jenkins turned the page of the notebook, her stomach twisting into painful knots. The entries over the next 3 days were short, clinical, and completely devoid of human empathy. Thorne wrote about how much he enjoyed listening to the police scanners, sitting in his patrol truck and laughing as he directed the frantic search and rescue teams in the complete opposite direction of his property. But by the 3rd day, the search had grown far larger than Thorne had ever anticipated. Helicopters were flying closer to his property line. Hundreds of volunteers were marching through the woods. He realized he could never let the children go, and keeping them fed and quiet underground was becoming too great of a risk. The final entry in the notebook was dated August 18th, 1998. It simply read, "The risk of discovery is too high, protocol terminated. I connected the heavy gas generator to the primary ventilation pipe. I let it run for 2 hours. It was peaceful." Jenkins slammed the notebook shut, gasping for air. The sweet, chemical smell lingering in the bunker wasn't an old cleaning supply. It was the faint, decades-old residue of carbon monoxide. Thorne had gassed them while they sat trapped in the dark. Beneath the final entry, Thorne had written a set of precise GPS coordinates. Jenkins rushed out of the bunker, her lungs desperately pulling in the fresh, damp mountain air. She immediately radioed the district command center. She gave them the coordinates from the notebook, and ordered the heavy excavation team to move to the back of the property, near a grove of ancient aspen trees. While the excavation team began their grim work, Jenkins checked in with the primary tactical unit back in Durango. The raid on Greg Thorne's suburban house had gone perfectly. They had kicked down his front door just as the sun was coming up. When the heavily armed officers stormed into his living room, Thorne didn't run. He didn't fight. He was sitting in his expensive leather armchair, sipping a cup of black coffee. When the tactical commander read him his rights, Thorne simply smiled a cold, arrogant smile and held out his wrists for the handcuffs. He knew exactly why they were there. He had lived with his terrible secret for 25 years, and he had honestly believed he would take it to his grave. By mid-afternoon, the excavation team in the mountains found what they were looking for. Buried deep beneath the soft, dark earth, perfectly wrapped in heavy canvas tarps, were the skeletal remains of Harrison, Clara, Julian, and Maya. They had been laid to rest side by side, their hands resting peacefully across their chests. Even in the face of unspeakable darkness, the four cousins had stayed together until the very end. Jenkins drove back down the mountain. The heavy gray clouds that had covered the sky all morning finally began to break, letting bright rays of warm sunlight shine through the pine canopy. But Jenkins felt no warmth. She had to do the hardest thing any police officer ever has to do. She drove straight to Paul Miller's house. When Jenkins pulled into the driveway, she saw Paul standing on the front porch. Diane Vance was standing right next to him. They had been waiting in agonizing suspense since Jenkins had rushed out of the house with the enhanced photograph 2 days earlier. Jenkins turned off the engine. She took a deep, shaky breath, stepped out of her unmarked car, and walked slowly up the concrete path. She didn't have to say a single word. The moment Paul looked into the detective's eyes, he knew. The heavy, sorrowful expression on Jenkins' face communicated a truth that words simply could not carry. Paul's knees completely gave out. He collapsed onto the wooden porch, letting out a raw, guttural cry that seemed to tear the very air apart. It was the sound of 25 years of desperate, burning hope finally being extinguished. Diane fell to her knees beside him, wrapping her arms around her brother-in-law, burying her face in his shoulder as she wept uncontrollably. Jenkins knelt on the porch with them. She put her arms around the grieving parents, tears streaming down her own face. She stayed with them on that porch for over an hour, holding them as the reality of their unimaginable loss finally settled in. She eventually explained everything. She told them about the bunker, the notebook, and the terrible betrayal of a trusted official. But most importantly, she looked them in the eyes and promised them that the monster who took their children would never, ever see the sky again. Because the evidence against him was absolutely insurmountable, the audio recording, the meticulous handwritten journal, the GPS coordinates, and the bodies found on his private property, Greg Thorne realized a trial would only end with him receiving the most severe punishment possible. To avoid a drawn-out, public spectacle, he pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and kidnapping. The judge showed absolutely zero mercy. During the sentencing hearing, the courtroom was packed with hundreds of people from Durango. Thorne stood silently in his orange prison jumpsuit, his face completely devoid of emotion or remorse. The judge sentenced him to 4 consecutive life terms in a maximum security federal penitentiary, ensuring that he would die locked inside a tiny, concrete cell, perfectly mirroring the nightmare he had inflicted upon those innocent teenagers. A month after the discovery, a massive memorial service was held in Durango. For 25 years, there had been 4 empty chairs at the family Thanksgiving table, but on this beautiful Sunday afternoon, there were 4 beautiful, polished wooden caskets resting side by side at the front of the local community church. The entire town shut down for the day. Thousands of people lined the streets, holding candles, carrying yellow ribbons, and bowing their heads as the hearses passed by. Harrison, Clara, Julian, and Maya were finally brought home. They were laid to rest in a peaceful, sunlit cemetery that overlooked the beautiful valley, far away from the dark shadows of the deep woods. The Vance and the Miller families would never truly heal, a wound that deep leaves a permanent scar on the soul. But for the first time in 25 years, they could finally sleep through the night. They no longer had to wonder if their children were out in the cold. They no longer had to look at the towering mountain peaks and wonder what secrets they were hiding. The terrifying unknown had been replaced by the painful, absolute truth, and with that truth came a profound sense of closure. This heartbreaking story remains a chilling reminder of the hidden dangers that can lurk behind a badge and a uniform. It proves that evil doesn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes, it stands right in front of us, offering a helping hand. But more importantly, this case stands as a powerful testament to the enduring strength of a family's love. Greg Thorne believed he had committed the perfect crime. He believed he was entirely untouchable. He had carefully manipulated the police. He had controlled the entire search grid, and he had buried his terrible secret under heavy steel and solid concrete. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. But in the end, he was entirely defeated by a simple, loving moment frozen in time. He was brought to justice not by a brilliant detective or a massive federal task force, but by a bright, 16-year-old artist named Clara, who just wanted to take one last beautiful picture of her family sitting around a warm campfire. That one fleeting moment of happiness, captured on a cheap, disposable camera, patiently waited in a dusty cardboard box for a quarter of a century, completely ready to shine a blinding light into the darkness and finally bring 4 lost children home.